Welcome to the She, He, We Awakening podcast. We are a wife and husband therapy team whose professional and personal lives are centered on psychology and spirituality.
We love sharing what we've learned on our journey of becoming conscious through relationship, and we invite you to get to know us and hopefully hear in our stories something that can support you in your life too.
Well, hello, my love. We meet again.
Hello.
Here we are to talk about change.
Yes. Transition, change, death, letting go.
You already spoiled the surprise.
I did.
Yes. That's okay. Oh, man. The big reveal. Okay. Well, the big surprise was that change is really synonymous with death. And that the word that captures the essence of both change and death is really transition. Right. But when people talk about being afraid of change, not liking change, maybe without knowing it, they are talking about being afraid of death, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And death as in an end of something.
Right. Yes, might sound strange, but being afraid of change is actually a bigger picture than being afraid of death. Death being just and I'm talking about dying as a human being just one of an infinite number of possible ways of going through a quote transition. Mm-hmm. Right. So human death is one kind of change, but people have, and that's a particular iteration that people have a great deal of specific conscious fear around, because the change or the transition has a lot of mystery to it. Mm-hmm. And for many other reasons that maybe we'll get into later. But beyond even the transition of human death, there is the reality of the constant change, constant transition of the human experience that people live out of alignment with. And those changes, as you inferred earlier, could rightly be called small deaths. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or they could at least be experienced as deaths, even though.
Yes.
The point of this podcast is to help people understand that nothing ever really begins or ends. Right. That we were all undergoing a process of continual transformation. And we can either perceive that or not.
Right. Yes. And so the better word that doesn't carry as much of an ominous quality as transition.
Right.
Yeah. So anytime we're talking about a change or a death, we're talking about a transition, a movement from one place to another, from one thing to another. Yes. And as is the nature of consciousness, that is always an expansion. Mm. We're not always in alignment or awareness of that. And so the extent to which we're not aware of that or in alignment with that is the extent to which we experience transition or change or death as suffering. But our perception of those transitions doesn't impact whether the transition is actually expansive or not. All of these transitions are inherently expansive, as is the nature of the reality of consciousness. There's only the movement into expansion.
Can I ask a question about that? Because I can predict how someone might respond to that.
Yes, ask the question.
So suppose someone has been experiencing a really lovely relationship, and the transition is the end of that relationship for some reason in moving into an experience that feels more like loneliness. Mm-hmm. Help this person, hypothetical person, understand how that's expansive.
Well, I'm going to use your words because those were perfectly chosen.
Mm.
It's expansive in that it is unbeknownst to the person who is suffering, it is helping that person um, shed the skin of the quote hypothetical person. It's not how you were using the words, but it was
Mm.
perfectly chosen. Um, the problem is the attachment to the identity of the hypothetical person, and that hypothetical person would be the thing that people call Noah, or the thing that
Mm.
people call Jamie, the small self.
Mm.
And so, in your example, somebody loses a loved one and they move into an experience of loneliness. And from the perspective of that quote hypothetical person, that thing that doesn't really exist in the way that we believe it exists, from the perspective of that entity, it looks like loss,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like loneliness. But the reality, the expansion, is that that experience is part of what um, transitions us and creates the change out of the identity as the small self, and brings us closer and closer to self-realization, to
Mm.
awareness of what we are in the impersonal divine sense, not the contracted, limited person sense.
Right. I'll give an example.
Great.
So when I was getting divorced, I had my sense of self very wrapped up in being a married person and being a mother. And through that transition process of having only partial custody of my kids and becoming a divorced person or a single person again, I had to let go of all of these concepts and ideas of who I thought I was. So I had these beliefs and ideas and clothing even of a wife and a mother. And so a huge part of my awakening process to who I know myself to be now was letting go of those roles and all of the associated, um, you know, responsibilities, etc.
Right.
And that was a hugely freeing experience for me. But at the time, I felt terrible.
Right. Felt
Like,
like
to be fair, it was
felt like a
terrible.
death. Yeah, felt like death.
Yes.
Yeah. And you say letting go of these
Hmm.
things. Another way of saying would be to let them die.
Hmm.
Right. Yes.
And I really did have to let it all die, because in order for me to come out of the suffering of the loss, I had to accept that those things, as I was with them before, the mothering that I was doing as part of a intact, family, the wifing, whatever that I was doing, was over and would never be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually true day to day in our lives. Like, the person that I was yesterday, the way I expressed, the way this being that I am expressed yesterday is dead and gone.
Right. And if it appears to be the same, it's only because we are habitually regenerating or
Yeah.
recreating ourselves based on the old template.
Perceiving ourselves in habitual ways.
Right.
Mm.
Right. But there is nothing static about this expression of who we are. There is the foundation of our unchanging self with a capital S, but in the day-to-day humaning, if you can be wifing, then the rest of us can just be humaning, right? The human being, the experience of the human being and doing, all of that is built on transition. It's constant transition, it's constant change. There's nothing static there. There is only each moment being created anew, and our experience of that depends on typically what we've experienced before.
Mm.
right? So we have a sense of, well, I woke up, bald with a white beard, a graying beard yesterday. And in my mind, there's a limitation that's created there where I'm going to build myself tomorrow on that same template. But there's nothing static about that. It's a constant recreation, a constant transition. That when we understand the nature of change and transition, then we get to actually become conscious in what things shift and change into. Or to put it in grander language, the preceding death takes on conscious meaning. It isn't just something was lost and now I've got to move on without it. It's this specific thing died to make way for and create space and to fertilize the ground in which I'm creating this next thing.
Mm.
And so that takes a lot of the charge and fear and mystery out of the concept of death or transition or change.
Mm. And it just occurred to me, and this is a science thing, so you can give me
Oh,
the
Lord.
real words for this.
Okay.
But I feel like in particle physics, like particles begin to change when you watch them, right?
Correct.
And so it occurred to me that I hear so often with when people say, I don't know, I like turned my head and my daughter was 20.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think to myself, how did you miss every day the transition from 0 to 20?
Right.
Because I guess because there wasn't enough presence or consciousness in the day-to-day, because we get into these habits of kind of going through the motions of our day and go to work every day, and it's kind of feels like Groundhog Day every day. But if you're really paying attention, there's both the simplicity and sameness of things and the eternal turning over of things.
Yes. And the sameness of things is always the experience of our self. That's
The
always,
observer.
yeah, that's always awareness being aware of itself. That's the only thing that doesn't change. That's the sameness, that's the stillness, that's the quiet, that's the experience that we call peace. And when we're still identified with the small self, the ego self, well, if stillness and the unchanging essence of self is the experience of peace, but we lose touch with that when we fall into ego self, which is by definition the lens through which all transition happens, then the experience of transition is going to be the opposite of stillness and peace and joy. It's going to feel like chaos and fear. And that's not its nature. That's the misperception. It's the misperception that transition is the essence of who I am, as opposed to transition being simply the essence of the experience of life as a human being. Right. Those are two very different things. And people may need to rewind and listen to that again, because I don't know if I can say it the same way again.
I think about it like now, from where I am now, I see it as, where am I standing? In what energy am I standing? Through what lenses am I looking? So I have many different pairs of glasses that I can wear. One pair is of a human being. And so when I look through the lenses of a human being and I'm in my human being energy, then the world can feel like it's constantly disruptive, changing, chaotic.
Right.
If I'm looking through the eyes of the self with a capital S, everything, it's sort of like when you look through one of those what, I forget what those things are called, but the little gadgets where you turn you turn the
Kaleidoscope.
dial, kaleidoscope, yeah, and you see the beautiful
Hmm.
mandalas of
Hmm.
color. That's what the world is looks like through the from the perspective of the witness.
Yes.
You're not in the little dial,
Right.
you're perceiving from the outside.
Yeah.
But from through the lens and through the experience of being Jamie or a human or a woman, whatever, subdivision of myself that I can create, then I'm going to have a whole different experience. So when I'm feeling any sort of emotion or confusion or anything, I stop and say, okay, which lens am I looking through right now?
Hmm.
And that helps me to differentiate between the chaos and the peace.
Yeah, I love that symbolism. So it's as though um, when we are finding ourselves disrupted by transition, when we're afraid of it or resisting it or out of alignment with it, or it seems to be working against us in some way, we have lost who we are. Well, we've lost the awareness of who we are, and we've fallen, literally, it's like you held up the kaleidoscope to your eye and then somehow fell into the kaleidoscope, and
Mm-hmm.
now you're being tumbled around as a part of the scenery,
Yeah.
and you've forgotten that it's just the scenery. It's not who you are, and it's not the most essential reality of your being. And so in a sense we could say that it's right for that perspective that has fallen into the kaleidoscope and is tumbling around. It's right for that thing to be afraid,
Mm-hmm.
because it will go away. Right? I mean, all of these things in creation are by definition impermanent. They are transitory,
Mm-hmm.
right? And hence transition. And so um, if that seems to be a problem, then we can be sure, like you just described, we can be sure that we have been wearing the wrong lens. We're viewing through the wrong lens, wearing the wrong perspective, that we've lost touch with who we are. Or more accurately, for most people, um, we have yet to find and
Mm-hmm.
discover and realize
Mm-hmm.
what we actually are.
Right.
And it's only through that self-discovery, capital S discovery, um, that we forever lose any sense of fear or hesitation around the experience of transition, because we know what we are beyond all of that as the stable eternal self.
I really like this kaleidoscope this thing metaphor,
Mhm.
because it also reminds me of the wheel of life. And like Hinduism and Buddhism, it talks about the wheel of life just keeps turning. And so if you're caught in the wheel and you're caught in the kaleidoscope amongst the little pieces that are being turned by the hand of God or by the hand of the creator, um, your configuration is going to continue to change.
Right.
No matter can be destroyed or eliminated, but your configuration is constantly going to be changing. So you're
Yep.
caught in that cycle of infinite change. And it does take a lot of practice to become still and quiet and move yourself back in the kaleidoscope tube to the
Mm.
point where you understand that you're witnessing and you are also turning the kaleidoscope.
Right. Yes. I love that. Yeah. And from that perspective, when we've remembered who we are and remain in touch with that, then regardless of the experience of the people in the kaleidoscope and whatever's going on there, the perspective from over here is, this is all beautiful.
It's a pattern.
Yeah. And
It has patterns to
it's
it, predictability
colorful.
almost.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And so that allows us to have the experience of our stillness and peace, and to enjoy the small r reality of creation, and to take part in it and celebrate it and enjoy it and work within it, and not fight the transition, not fight the movement, because we're aware that, coming back to that first thing I said, that all transition is expansion. Yeah. All transition is movement that ultimately shakes us out of our lostness in the kaleidoscope, and shakes us towards the observer perspective. Yeah. So, yes. Did we want to show the card?
Sure. Why don't we show?
So go ahead.
So a couple of years ago, we taught an entire class on the major arcana of the tarot. And we wanted to pull up the death/transition card today and do a little refresher for people who took the class, but also introduce the concept of this card to anyone who hasn't yet taken that class.
Yeah, and I don't think we'll go into tremendous detail. We've always got the class recorded that we can get people access to, but I think the reason to look at this card during this talk, and the reality is that every talk we do has some correlation to the major arcana. We could pull up a card for everything. But why this one? Well, because this one's particularly evocative. I mean, this is one that really, I think, grabs people. I mean, this symbol of death is just so well known and so pervasive, and is used in what is going on here? I mean, it's been used in print and TV and movies.
Find it on T-shirts.
The skeleton with the scythe, the angel of, put a cloak on it and you've got the angel of death, right? And it grabs us viscerally. I think it grabs us in that, punches us right in that misunderstanding of what death is, and it's that misunderstanding that leads us to utilize this image as the essence of horror. Right? This thing coming for you is, sort of the most primal of human fears, and all of that is based on fundamental misunderstanding of death. In the more recent iterations of tarot, you'll see this card, actually they've changed the name to transition, because it does capture the essence of this and puts the emphasis back on the change part. But that's what death is. Death is simply a transition or a change. So the reason for the skeleton is that the human skeleton is the most kind of essential structure or framework of the human body. So we could say that the skeleton is the essential part of the human. It's what shapes us and makes us look like a human. Without the skeleton, there isn't really a resemblance to being a human being. So immediately when we understand that symbol, it points us towards this reality that transition or death or change is fundamental to the experience of being human. And as soon as we get on board with that, our experience of transition changes pretty quickly. When we understand that you can't fight this thing. This is built into the human experience. And so it's not about fighting it, it's about getting into alignment with it.
Surrendering. Yeah.
Surrendering.
Accepting
Yeah.
it.
Yep. So essentially what's going on in this picture is that this agent of change is coming through and swinging its scythe, which is a harvesting tool. Uh, Not a harvesting tool, a threshing tool. It's used to separate the wheat from the chaff, literally. And so we take that symbolically, and the teaching of this card is about bringing us into alignment with the nature of human experience, which is transition, and putting us in the role here. We become angels of death in our own experience, in our own life, which sounds really scary and ominous. But what that means is that we become conscious of being the one turning the kaleidoscope. When we act in accordance with the teaching that is depicted here symbolically, that's what begins to shake us out of being lost in the tumbler here, and brings us back towards the observer agent perspective of our true self. And so the call here is for us to become active participants in the transition experiences of our life, and to choose to look around at what we've cultivated, to look at the garden of our life experience and say, over here, oh, look at this nice pretty rose. I want to keep this. I don't swing at this. This stays. Over here, we've got some weeds. These get pulled up. Over here's this relationship that I've had for 10 years with this person that when we were kids brought me a lot of joy. And now every time I tune into it, I just don't have anything in common with this person anymore. And it feels like a drain on my energy to try to keep this relationship alive. And I'm just going to decide I'm going to swing the scythe and let this thing die, to make room for something else to grow. That's a pretty, I think, topical example in the age of social media, where we're inundated with the idea that you can be friends with 5,000 people. You can't.
It's not very sustainable. I've been trying.
I hate to break it to you. You can't do that. You cannot have active friendships with 5,000 people. You can have active friendships with a couple of people. I mean, if a dozen people to 24 people that's a lot of relationship maintenance. So we need to be selective, right? In this particular example, about how many relationships we can engage in, but more generally speaking, we have to be selective about what types of experiences we are willing to and want to allow to grow in life. And that's it. That's what this card is about. It's about allowing ourselves to become this agent of change. Before we can really become the agent of change, we have to first accept that change is essential to the human experience. We have to stop fighting it. And then we can begin to work with it in partnership. And then we can become the actual agent of change, which is really to say becoming the creator of our life experience. Right.
One thing I want to say about relationships in particular, I have never actually had the experience of a loss of a relationship or a death of a relationship. I've only had the perception of that. Everyone in my life that I've ever known has remained in my life. And it's because I haven't forgotten them. So I have lost the marriage, and that relationship has evolved. And I maintain a relationship with my ex-husband that now revolves around parenting. There are friends that I have no contact with anymore, but I remember them, I know them. Sometimes they come across my screen through Facebook or in some other fashion. So there remains a connection there because we can actually never be disconnected from anyone. We have the perception of an ending, but really all that's happened is there's been a transition into a new way of being with that person.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Um, you're speaking to the sort of highest reality of our unity, connectedness, which of course is true. Um, I think, and I'm curious to hear your take on this. I think where most people are.
Can you go back to the full screen before you say that? Sorry. I am struggling to see you. You're like a tiny little square in the corner.
I think that before people can move into the appreciation of the truth of what you just shared, they have to be willing to let the thing die, like truly die, and this is gone, and that's okay. I think that there are lots of experiences where that's had to be okay for me. So I'm in touch with the truth of what you're saying, but I also, my experience is that I have absolutely had relationships that I've recognized are just not what they once were, and that attempts to act like this relationship is the same as it's always been, had this sort of forced and artificial quality that didn't bring me any joy, and that began to feel more and more like a drain on my resources, and that I had to be willing to let that relationship go. And again, this has happened in a number of relationships for me. And yes, I can tune into that person if I so choose, but I usually don't. I mean, I know there are relationships that have gone from my life, and I probably will never think of that person again unless they, I run into them on the street corner at some point. And I've had to let that be okay and recognize that that's not a problem. That's not an indictment of that other person. That we aren't saying something derogatory or demeaning or condescending to or about that other person when we say this relationship is no longer serving me. This relationship is not something that bears fruit, right? It just feels kind of sterile and dried out. And that's a commentary on the relationship and really our experience of the relationship that has nothing to do with the quality of that human being on the other end. And I think that's difficult for some people to accept, on both sides of the equation. So recently I've had a number of people in the office having some experience of this, where they're still tied into these relationships that are depleting the joy of their life. And these people are conscious of not moving on from that relationship out of a fear that makes them a bad person, or that makes them judgmental, or because they don't want the other person's feelings to be hurt. And these are all of that energy is antithetical to the energy and teaching of the card that we showed, the transition card, the death card, which says, no, you must choose. You must become the creative agent in your own life experience. And the nature, the skeleton, the essence of being human means having to choose. You cannot have all of this in your human. You cannot be friends with every person on the planet. You just can't. You can love every person on the planet, but you can't maintain active relationships with them all. You can't have all the jobs. You can't play with dolphins and be a teacher and be a firefighter and be a therapist. You love
Mhm.
all of those things, but you're going to have to choose, because you can't maintain all of that at once. And when we refuse to choose or fail to choose, when we don't swing that scythe, then the garden gets choked out and nothing of value can grow.
Mhm.
Because even things that on their own are life-giving and beautiful and fruitful, when there's too much of it, it all chokes itself out. Trees have to be planted, in an orchard at a certain spacing from one another to be able to grow and bear fruit. If there's too many trees overlapped with flowers and bushes, even if none of them are weeds, even if they're all beautiful things, if they're all trying to grow in the same space, then nothing really is going to grow to its full potential. So, yeah, I don't know that I'm
Mm.
disagreeing with you. It's more of the
Yeah.
other half. It's the other
Yes.
side of the reality of this,
Well,
the
from
reality of death.
going back to the pre-trans conversation that we had in the last episode,
Yep.
the pre and the middle experience is absolutely one of, I have to be willing to let this die,
Yep.
which really means I have to surrender and accept that this thing is going to change whether I like it or not.
Mhm.
It's already happening. And in fact, if I become clear that it needs to change, I can kind of force it along or encourage it to
Yep.
change quicker.
Mhm.
However, from the trans place, when I look back at my life, I see that I've never been disconnected or experienced death.
Yes.
I have never experienced death. I
Yep.
have not once. And sort of tangential, but one of the things that a lot of spiritual teachers will teach people is how to break cords with people, how to cut cord connections or dissolve them in love or whatever you want
Mm.
to call it. And that used to be something that I felt very weird about.
Mhm.
I didn't know why I felt weird about it, but I, did my due diligence along the learning path and I played with that and I saw, and you know what? Every time I cut a cord with someone, that cord grew back. I
Mm.
watched the energy of that grow back and I thought, man, I am so codependent that I can't let this person go. And after a period of time, I realized, oh, I am one with everything. These things are a part of me.
Mm.
I cannot cut them off.
Yes.
So why am I like fooling myself, telling myself I'm like, codependent? I was from a pre-middle place. I needed to work on that for sure. But from a trans place, it becomes a whole different understanding of
Right.
energy evolving and relationships changing and everyone's really like within my heart and there is no outsider or other person anyways.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
Perfect. I hadn't been thinking about the fact that we had just done that talk. So yes, you're right. I agree. That's exactly what it is. That um, it's the phenomenon of the pre and the trans. And yes, before we can get into that transcendent experience of death is an illusion, right? We have to move from the pre-place into this solid middle foundation of um, transition is the essence of the human life experience.
Mhm.
And I need to actively get on board with that.
Yeah.
And yes, and it's by getting into alignment with that and participating with this agency of death and transition that we come to this realization. And you already essentially said that. You said that you had to become this massive agent of change in your own life in ways that were really painful. You had to swing this scythe everywhere and kill everything that you had known and loved for your whole life. Let it decompose and return to the soil of creation and become fertilizer for what was to grow next. And then what grew next in part was this realization that, oh, what I thought was dead and gone actually can never really die.
Mm.
Yeah. Let me tell you more about your experience.
I think you did a good job.
Thanks. Spiritual mansplaining.
So our suffering happens when we see that the form is changing, that things are dying or changing, and we resist it.
Mm-hmm.
And suffering also happens when we know that change should be happening and that we would be more in alignment if it happened sooner. And yet we do not have, we don't have the capacity yet or the clarity yet to help that along.
Yes. Or coming back to this card, this death card as an agency, we are either afraid of the agency of death working itself in our life,
Mm-hmm.
and or we are afraid of becoming the agency of death and working those effects in our life.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so people have both of those experiences of actively resisting change as an external force, saying, no, I want this to be the same. I like where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
And I want this to stay the same. And so we're resisting change as if it's an external agency, which by definition throws us into the far end of the kaleidoscope.
Yeah.
As soon as we treat death as something other than us,
Mm-hmm.
then we become that small, egoic, separate, confused, illusioned self being jostled around in the end of the kaleidoscope. And that experiences suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other experience that people have is recognizing, as you said, that it's time for something to change, and not being willing or able to step into that role. So there's an understanding that they actually are the agent,
Or
right?
can, yeah, yes.
Right, or recognition that this is a change that desperately needs to happen, and
Mm-hmm.
I am the only way that that's going to come to be, but I don't like that. And so there we're resisting the reality of our self as the agent of change. And
it's like two people in a relationship that both know the relationship is sinking, and neither one of them wants to be the death card skeleton person.
Yep.
And they're just waiting for the other one to be.
Yes. And I think that it's very common in relationships. I know that was common for me. What you just described is the experience that I had. And I think just like we perceive this, death figure as a projection in movies and such, we're afraid of becoming the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that by being this agent of change and transition, that makes us the bad guy. And we don't want to step into that role, even though that's the role of the self. And that's the role of power and personal agency and personal creatorship in your life. But there are fears that are immediately pulled up that, again, I'm going to be the bad guy. I'm responsible for this person's feelings.
Mm-hmm.
This person isn't going to understand, which is often true, and
Mm-hmm.
nothing that you can really do about that.
Right.
But it's understanding that this death figure is an agent of love. That's the essence of what's happening here. It's tough love sometimes, um, but it's love in a higher understanding of the nature of life experience, which is that um, I have a vision for what I want to create, and it unfolds in stages, and certain things will grow that are wonderful and beautiful that I'm then going to have to say goodbye to, or allow them to die or kill them, and
Mm.
use them as the compost out of which the next stage grows. But all of that can be done in our life in a loving energy, and it doesn't make us the bad guy, even if the other person
Still thinks we are.
yeah, even if the other person
Yeah.
is having the same sort of the inverse experience, which is that they are afraid of their projection of change, and you're afraid of yourself being an agent of change, and they're afraid of you also being an agent of change, right?
Right.
And so they're over there resisting change from the outside, and you're over here resisting change from the inside. And yeah, I mean, there's a good argument that that's the only death that really exists, which would be something like stagnation.
Mm.
um
Suffocation and old
yeah,
energy.
yeah,
Yeah.
which also isn't real, but the experience of
Yeah.
it can be.
Right. I think when I think back over in my marriage, I was not very conscious through a lot of it. But I can see that the marriage was changing over time. I see that now in retrospect. And there could have been times when I could have swung the scythe sooner. And so it felt like it was getting more and more stagnant. The reality is it was changing and evolving into something that couldn't live anymore
Right.
as it was.
Yep. Yeah, and if we stick with the horror motif, um this stagnancy, not just
Yeah.
the horror of your marriage or my marriage.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the death skeleton thing,
Yeah.
the angel of death, that kind of horror motif. When we refuse to let things die, and again, we're not keeping them from dying. We're refusing to acknowledge that they're
That they're
dead,
dying and dead
dying or
already.
dead.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then what we've created are zombies. I mean, that's it's these things
Yeah.
that are just really poor mimics of
Oh,
life,
yeah.
right?
Going through
That
the motions in your life.
Yeah, I mean, they're really
Yeah.
dead, but there's this kind of
Mm.
puppet game going on,
Hmm.
and um, we keep trying to resuscitate what's 50% rotted and decomposed, and
Hmm.
it's not pretty, and it's
Yeah.
not enjoyable.
I think everyone's had the experience of staying, if not in a relationship, but in a job too long. And
Mhm.
it's just you are like a zombie at that job.
Yeah.
You walk in every day, you're going through the motions
Hmm.
because you haven't accepted that this job for you is gone now. It's
Yep.
it's on its way out and it's time to have a new experience.
Yes, and you and I have had versions of that with the way that we work, the
Hmm.
forms of our work several times over the years. And it's not like it has to be um, movement on from. It's not always going to look like, oh, this job, they cut my pay in half, and my boss is abusive, and the conditions are terrible, and I don't get any bathroom. It doesn't have to look awful. It can be like our work was something that we still thrived on and
Yeah.
loved and enjoyed, and thought, I'll speak for myself again, or maybe for the first time today, that my experience of that was thinking, oh, this is it. Like, I've found it. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I'm awesome at it. I love it. It's fun. I'm great. Pays well, whatever. Right. And despite my attempts to hold on to that and make that true, the reality of the agency of death came marching through my life, and started, and this is before I had the identification with it, and started
Mm.
swinging the scythe, and I'm going, no, what are you doing? why
Mhm.
why is this happening? And um yeah, and I had to ultimately get on board with it. And that was, again, it started as an experience of suffering and loss, and then became, or what it didn't become, it always was, but I later recognized what an amazing experience of expansion. My life would be so much worse off if I had continued to fight this.
Yeah.
Um,
Tried to stay and zombify
yeah,
yourself. Yeah.
yeah. And the tough thing for people to accept is that microcosm, that experience that I just described about a shift in work, that is true of all transition and all death all the time. No matter what your logic brain wants to say about it, no matter how offended somebody might get, we've all lost, in quotes, people that we love. Um, we have all experienced the death of the human being, and create stories of loss and tragedy out of that. And as tough as this might be to hear, the more convinced we are that it's a loss and a tragedy, the more stuck we are in the false impotence of this illusory ego self, which is not who we are. It's not what we are. And that just like the easier to swallow example of work, a dramatic example like that, the loss of a loved one, when moved through and recognized after the fact of self-realization, we see, to your point, that that person was absolutely not lost, that in fact they are closer than ever, and that the entire experience was one of expansion.
I just read a story today. I love to read stories about saints, yogic saints and Buddhist saints. And in this one story, the saint, whose name is Maharaji, was walking with one of his disciples along a road. And the disciple had a beautiful watch on his wrist. And Maharaji said to his disciple, "Oh, you've been wearing that watch for about 6 months. Where did you get it?" And the disciple said, "I got this from my nephew. He picked it out especially for me." And Maharaji said, "Go take your watch and smash it right now." And so the disciple immediately goes and smashes the watch. And one of the other disciples who's with them watching this is like appalled that this, treasured object that was given with so much love by this person's family member had to be relinquished in this way. But the disciple who smashed his watch said, "I was getting too attached to this. Maharaji was right. I needed to let it go."
Yep.
And so, that's an extreme example. That's asceticism is part of the Hindu culture. But we have to be willing to sacrifice things in our life when
Yes.
they are holding us back.
Yes, thank you for using that word. That's exactly the essence of that agency, where I call it a loving agency. It's a sacrifice, and sacrifice means to make sacred. And so it's that loving agency of change coming in and sacrificing something that does have some value. If it didn't have value, it wouldn't be a sacrifice.
Right. Just
That's
taking
the
the
whole
garbage
point.
bag out.
Right. Right. That's why you throw the young virgin girl into the volcano who has her whole life in front of her, not the 100-year-old,
Cancer patient who's like ready
right.
to die
Who's,
now.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. The volcano knows, nope, sorry, that didn't count.
Mm.
That's not a sacrifice. Yeah. It's the things that we, that quote have value, and it's in quotes because that's the problem, is that we are projecting the value that only dwells within ourself into some object where it gets stuck, and then we get attached to it over here, and we begin to misperceive that value and love is found in objects, including a partner,
Mm.
right? That's the ultimate misconception, that if I lose you, I've lost love, or that um, I need you in physical form to feel complete or whole, or to share what it is that is actually valuable about this relationship.
Right.
Yeah. And if I'm overly attached to that, and you transition first, then my experience is going to be one of suffering.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, what are your take homes for people in terms of how to be with the energy of transition and everything we've talked about?
Well, first of all, is to really dig in to accepting that change is inevitable. If you can't do that, you're not getting anywhere. You got to really begin to see in your life how change is inevitable. Start looking around. It's everywhere. It's in nature. We go through cycles. We have menstrual cycles. Everything is being our entire bodies change over every 7 years or whatever they say. It's built into life. So change is inevitable, accepting that as much as you can and working on accepting that every day. Noticing where you have resistance to change and looking at what things you're clinging to. And when you find yourself clinging to something and wanting it to be permanent as it is, practice softening. So for me, that looks like, we have this office that we're in right now. There's a really good real-time example.
Yeah.
We have this office that we're in right now, and I have a really beautiful room in this office filled with plants and crystals, and life is calling me right now and is showing me, and I'm actually seeing it in advance for once, that we are evolving as a company. Our way of working is evolving, and we need to change our location.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I find myself wanting to cling to the energy of the space that we're in and build more roots there, I say no, soften and allow. It's sort of an inner energy experience of just letting go and just letting go.
Yes.
When I see Mia having an experience of growing up and being different, and I don't like it, or I have some kind of attachment to how she should be, I say no, and I soften and I let it be, and I let her change and grow. Doesn't mean if she's doing something dangerous, I don't intervene. Obviously, I need to do that. But most of the time, I'm letting her grow and do what nature does.
Okay. So as usual, you have shared a feminine way of
Mm-hmm.
surrendering to death
Mm-hmm.
and the reality of that. And then I'll offer the more masculine energy version, which is to just take it on faith for now, that you are the agency of change in your life, and find ways where you can begin tiptoeing from the place of comfort into the place of discomfort with respect to being that agency of change, which is to say, spend some time looking around your life at what you suspect or quietly know but don't want to admit is something that's stale or outdated or stagnant or zombified, and pick up the scythe and swing it.
Yeah.
And for me,
Act.
a recent, not too distant memory is a couple years ago when we moved, and I literally had boxes of like memorabilia and stuff that it's stayed in a box for like 25 years. and the box has just moved from like literally all over the world.
Yeah.
Right. And so the first instinct is to open it and go, oh my gosh, I forgot. Oh, this is great, great. Right. And go, okay, this is dead weight.
Yeah.
And swing the scythe, throw it away, donate it, whatever. Um, things like that. Relationships, where I've had to, and you can find loving ways to do it, where I've just had to say, no, I don't, I don't really feel compelled to meet. I've got a lot going on. And I mean, you don't have to be, most people aren't going to get it. You don't have to,
Yeah.
no, I find that this relationship is really just a zombie, and you don't, you don't have to go there. You can find loving ways to just say, I'm good. I appreciate you reaching out. I hope you're doing well. I still have that come up. Somebody reached out not too long ago, a friend from actually exactly 20 years ago, that I've just barely kept in touch with. And this person sort of reaches out, and I can tell wants the relationship to be what it once was, and it's just not. It's not, and I'm not willing to let it be. I'm in a very different place in my life, at a different energy, and so I've just found ways to just quietly say, hey, I hope you're doing well. No, I can't get together. I've got a lot going on. Thanks for reaching out. I hope you're doing well.
Right.
And people will get the message.
Yeah.
So yes, find places to practice swinging that scythe.
And I think even swinging the scythe doesn't have to look like ending something. It can also look like allowing something new to begin,
Well,
like
our
trying
point,
something new.
yes, I mean, our point with this whole teaching, maybe we haven't explicitly said this, so good catch. Those are the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Is that transition is a liminal space. It's the doorway between the old and the new. And it is entirely arbitrary when you stand in a doorway, whether you perceive yourself to be leaving one room, which is to say something is dying, or entering another room, which is to say something is being born. It is entirely arbitrary as to which perspective you choose. And of course, both are true at the same time.
Right.
And they're always exactly and perfectly simultaneously true. The doorway, this card that we showed, this death card, the experience of transition in life, it is the eternal now, which is a doorway. And we live existence on this threshold of what was and what will be. And there's only this present liminal space of now. And sometimes we turn around and go, oh, look at all that stuff that's died. And sometimes we look ahead and go, oh, look at over there. But we're always in the doorway. And so the death and rebirth, we call it a cycle, because that tends to look and play out that way in the sort of protracted human mind experience, linear time. Thank you. What's that stuff called again? Right, linear time. But that's not the reality of it. The reality of it is there's just the one thing. There's just transition, and it's entirely arbitrary whether we call that death or birth. So,
okay.
All right. Good work. Happy death rebirth to all of you with your scythe swinging and surrendering. And we will see you next time.